There's a type of cell found throughout vertebrates, even primitive vertebrates like lampreys, known as melanocytes. These cells have a very interesting structure. They develop from neural crest cells, and they can send out extensions of themselves and then inject pigment into neighboring cells. So notice the very long processes extending from these cells, these melanocytes. Notice that they are full of vesicles of the primary pigment in vertebrates, melanin. Melanin is typically a brown to black pigment, although that can vary a bit. And notice that these cells can send out their extensions and then even inject this pigment melanin into neighboring cells. So here you can see in a lamprey skin, look at these cells known as melanocytes sending out very long processes of themselves where they can interact with other cells. The pigmentation associated with human skin is not going to be primarily due to the melanocytes per se, but rather the melanin that they inject into neighboring cells. So that was an image of some vertebrate melanocytes. In human skin, for example, one can find in the epidermis melanocytes. And notice that the cells themselves, they're not necessarily accumulating pigment. They are injecting pigment into other cells. And so here you can see, it's not the melanocytes, which are the darkest cells. The majority of the melanocytes are in the basalmost layer of the epidermis, the stratum basale, but they inject vesicles of melanin into neighboring cells. So these neighboring cells, especially in the basal layers, are then protected from UV light. Here, it doesn't matter as much. These cells are about to die. And so if they were damaged by UV light, the risk of cancer would be minimal since these cells are short-lived. However, the melanocytes do want to protect those stem cells at the basalmost layers because they undergo a lot of cell division, and they will be retained in the body and not shed. And so melanin is injected into these cells, which in addition to the normal variation, which I'll mention in a second, simply then protects them from ultraviolet light, given that ultraviolet light can cause mutations and that melanin absorbs ultraviolet light. Now, when we compare different individuals, and once again we can speak of humans specifically rather than other vertebrates, one notices great differences in hair color, in skin color, and in eye color. And as we study genetics, we study the sources of human variation, and this is obviously a visible source of human variation, which is of interest. Now, the melanocytes, they tend to be relatively constant in number. So individuals with, very darkly pigmented skin compared to, say, albinos who were not making any melanin, they would have similar number of melanocytes. The question would then be the activity and the type of melanin which is made. And so when you compare an individual with darker skin to an individual with lighter skin, the difference is not the number of melanocytes, but how much melanin they have produced, the type of melanin that they have produced and injected into neighboring cells. In the same way, hairs have follicles where the matrix of the hair has melanocytes, and once again, melanin can be then injected into the keratinocytes, which compose the hair. The genetics of this involves multiple genes, so let me just kind of go through this. So once again, these are the keratinocytes, which make up the majority of the epidermal cells. But these melanocytes can now extend their processes and inject melanin into the cells, where then melanin can absorb ultraviolet light and protect from mutations. Now, this is not entirely understood, but then there are other consequences to this. We make vitamin D, which is essential. It helps our intestines absorb calcium, which is needed then for bone growth. We make vitamin D when sunlight hits our skin. And so while there is an advantage to having melanin, it protects us from skin cancer and ultraviolet light. If one was making a great deal of melanin, especially if you were living far from the equator prior to our modern times, where we can say fortify milk with vitamin D, it is thought that then, because you're protecting your skin from sunlight, then you might absorb less sunlight, make less vitamin D, and this might have a number of consequences, like on bone growth, and vitamin D is important for a number of things. And so the value of how much melanin is made, there are a number of factors to be considered. Also to be considered that those vesicles of melanin actually come in two forms. There are the pheomelanosomes, which will produce more of a reddish pigment, and then the eumelanosomes. And so melanocytes can make different type of melanosomes, which then can have two different forms of melanin. Now, melanin is made from an amino acid tyrosine, and there's an enzyme called tyrosinase, which then converts tyrosine to melanin. Now, we vary in lots of things. Blood typing genes can vary for type A, type B, type O, etc. And there are some variations of tyrosinase which can produce melanin with slightly different hues, lighter hue, and then there can be genetic disorders associated with abnormal function of tyrosinase, or tyrosinase which does not function, or an overexpression of tyrosinase, say in melanoma. And so clearly this is under genetic control. There are a number of genes involved, but the major ones control whether or not eumelanosomes with their brown to black pigment are made, or the pheomelanosomes with the more reddish pigment is made. And cells can make both, but they are signaled to do so by hormones, primarily the hormone MSH, the melanocyte stimulating hormone, but ACTH can also have a role. Hormones obviously then bind to receptors. And so to signal a cell to make to signal cells to make the eumelanosomes with the darker brown to black pigment, MSH or ACTH need to bind the receptor, and that will cause now the majority of the melanosomes to become eumelanosomes, which then affect pigment. However, as we vary, there can be variations in the hormone which would make that interaction less likely. So for example, this is rare, but some individuals might not make functional hormone which would trigger this receptor. More likely, however, some individuals would not make the receptor, or make a less than functional receptor. And this would then cause, instead of a balance between the reddish pheomelanosomes and the brown eumelanosomes, an accumulation of the reddish pigment. These individuals would tend to have lighter skin, not making the eumelanin, and then red hair. This is a major cause of red hair, although there are others. Such individuals might not suntan well, and then might have to be very careful with sunlight because they could burn quite easily, not making the U melanin, which would protect them from burns and from skin cancer. And so there are several genes given here. Now, not only do these vary among individuals, but also among ethnic groups. The original humans had dark skin, dark hair, and dark irises. And obviously, a very large percentage of humans alive today still have these features that they've inherited from the earliest members of our species, Homo sapiens. However, different groups of humans have then modified this ancestral feature, perhaps once again because they were living farther from the equator, and the amount of melanin they were producing was then altering the amount of vitamin D that they were making. And so it was, there are differences between the changes genetically which Asians have accumulated to decrease the amount of melanin made in their skin versus Europeans. Now, I'll show again specifically, there are a few which are shared, but then there are also differences. And so this trait of making less melanin in the skin seems to have developed separately. There are other genes as well. So for example, there are agouti signaling proteins which can inhibit this interaction by blocking this receptor site. And if the receptor site is blocked, now obviously MSH cannot interact. And then there are still others that might affect the pH of a melanosome, which could affect how much melanin could be produced, or ions in melanosomes, etc., or the amount of cysteine added in the melanin, which would potentially make it lighter in color. And so there are a number of genes which are potentially involved here. So once again, the ancestral humans had brown to black skin, brown to black hair, and brown to black eyes. Oops. From this ancestral condition, some populations migrated out of Africa relatively recently. Homo sapiens seems to be between 200 and 300,000 years of age as a species, whereas perhaps 80 to 100,000 years ago, some populations migrated into Asia and spread throughout Asia, and then perhaps 40,000 years ago, populations reached Europe. Now, there were other populations of humans there. We know that in Asia, Homo sapiens interbred at least with the Denisovans species, which was already in Asia prior to Homo sapiens getting there, as did the Homo sapiens, which reached Europe, interbreed with the Neanderthal population, which was already there. And so there would have been multiple chances for variation and selective pressures, etc. Some of the lightening of skin color in some populations are then shared between Asians and Europeans, having changes in similar genes at the same sites. But then there are changes which are specific to Asian populations, and then also then to European populations. If we were to look at hair color, once again, hair color was ancestrally brown to black. And there are mutations in multiple genes, which can cause red hair. Once again, if you don't synthesize a hormone or a signal, then you can't signal the cells to make more of those U melanosomes. Or if you don't make the receptor, then the same thing would apply. And then there are other genes. Some are the homologs of tyrosinase. Some affect the pH of melanosomes or ion content of melanosomes. They can create other variants like blonde hair. There are a number of genes which can affect then the amount of pigment we put in the pupil, my fault, I'm sorry, the iris of our eyes. But the major genes for the variation are the two genes next to each other, the OCA2 and its neighbor HERC2. One gene, OCA2, is required to put the brown to black pigment in, the iris. But its neighbor is where a factor will bind, which allows the transcription of the first gene, the OCA2 gene. As we can discuss later, chromosomes can change how they package genes on a protein scaffolding, and this changes how accessible they are. So if OCA here in brown is coiled and packaged onto the protein scaffolding, it isn't accessible to be expressed and thus to produce the proteins which would then cause more pigmentation. But if a transcription factor can bind HERC2, that will then change the packaging of the DNA on the chromosome and remodeling the chromatin, allowing OCA2 to be made, and now the enzymes for brown eyes. But if there's a variant in HERC2, even though this gene isn't involved directly in making pigment, then that would prevent the remodeling of the chromatin, which would then prevent the production of brown eyes. So this is the major variation for brown versus blue eyes. And the change for blue eyes is a recessive mutation. Now, as I had mentioned before, it ends up being very, more complicated in that let's imagine all of these individuals have the same gene to make brown eyes. But nevertheless, even though they have the same gene, there could then be subsequent genes, which could then affect the amount of pigment made or the hue of the pigment. Remember, you can attach other things to melanin and change its hue, or have it produced in spots or a ring around the iris, or even some genes which are capable of silencing other genes. And so even if there are primary genes involved in pigmentation, then there's many other possible genes involved as well. One last concept is that of haplotype. If you were to ask, in say the OCA gene for brown versus blue eyes, where is the amino acid which varies to cause a change? And the answer could be, well, if you have a change here, all right, that would increase the frequency at which someone might have blue eyes. So some individuals with this variant position might have blue eyes. Some individuals with this position might have a variant blue eyes. Same thing here, but those who have the greatest ability to have, or likelihood of having blue eyes, now have all three of those. So very often when we deal with mutant alleles or variant alleles, we're not just talking about one change. We're talking about potentially a series, which combination you have. And thus we use the term haplotype. So this would be a haplotype having these three specific changes in those three positions. In the same way, if one were to ask, what is the genetic change to result in red hair? Well, changing this position, all right, could cause some red hair in your offspring. Same thing here, same thing here. But then there could be a high likelihood if all three of those. And so if we're going to deal with multiple variations and which combinations you have, we could then ask which haplotype do you have? And the haplotype is not just referring to one variant, but rather multiple. So this was just a little bit on the genetics in the variation of the pigmentation of skin, hair, and eye color.